Proportional Response, Book 1. Chapter 21, Part 4. The Tears of Looma. Looma sat stoically in the command chair of Belinith Station. Well, she tried to sit stoically. You'd think after over 3 weeks I would have no tears left. She had managed, at least, to hold the tears back when on duty. Barely. Well, mostly. She watched her screens as another Sultan ship fired up its singularity and left with loot from her precious world. She'd read the reports. Any place that the Zoltan troops landed, they took anything that wasn't nailed down. Not just food, fuel, weapons, or other materials that might support the war effort. They took gold, jewels, art, anything they could get their claws on. Some had started fighting back, but leadership hadn't trained bulls up in any quantity in generations. The few bulls they had on the planet were fighting hit-and-fade actions where they could, but had to concentrate on keeping offensives against major cities off balance. Another Sultan ship crossed into her senses, and she felt, in spite of herself, a tiny surge of hope. Maybe this ship will be the one to return my third son. If I had known he was on one of those last cargo ships. She listened with half an ear as one of her comms operators attempted to raise the Zoltan freighter per proper protocol, and heard the freighter ignore the hail to answer the challenge from the Zoltan flag ship instead. It gave the freighter its flight path and took receipt of the cargo manifest, which it then transmitted to her. Not to the station, not to tower control as they should have done, but directly to her. She wanted to gnash her teeth at the insult, but didn't have the wherewithal to do so. She tried to protest the flagship's heavy-handed treatment of her and her staff, only to be told that if she continued to bother them, they'd quit sending her the manifests she'd requested. Requested, more like groveled for. She thought to herself as she reviewed the list of former indentures being transferred to her. Gorful, Venter, Findle, Abitha. That is odd. Not a single Cothro in the lot. She skipped to the end to check the rest of the details, and found just what she expected. The funds to pay out the contracts for these indentures had not travelled with them. They have no money to help buy passage to their own worlds, nor even to buy some of their own food or clothing. I wonder if these have even been fed in the last few days. She heard a commotion on the deck and turned weary eyes towards the second traffic controller. The man had begun to shout into his microphone. It doesn't matter how many of the indentures you have loaded, and no one cares that the Venter are neutral in the conflict, nor that you are flying under their flag. You have to clear that berth immediately. The Zoltan flagship just reassigned a freighter, one on approach to the station, to your berth. A tug will be to you in 20 minutes. You have until it arrives to close your hatches, clear the fuel lines, and decouple. If you aren't ready for the tug when it arrives, we will blow the hatches and decouple the fuel lines from our side and charge you for the repair. She heard the captain of the Ruxa freighter begin to complain, so she cut herself into the channel. She didn't even have to say anything, just to look at the cat-like Ruxa on the other end. She recognized him as one of the captains she'd spoken to dozens of times, both on comms and in person. They looked at one another for several moments. Then, the Ruxa nodded and made a strange gesture with his hand. The captain then turned away from her and started issuing orders, starting with one to cut the channel. Looma sat back in her chair, giving a minimal acknowledgement to the harried-looking controller's grateful glance. An alarm flared, warning that a ship had decoupled from the fuel lines without notifying control. Again, the Zoltan freighter then fired thrusters far too close to the station and turned to leave. She considered, once again, finding a way to accidentally cause a spark and set the fuel the freighter caused to be sprayed across its own hull to ignite, but knew she couldn't. Even if it was truly an accident, the Zoltan would punish her and her crew for the damage to their ship. They delight in making our lives difficult, drop us refugees that have to be forwarded elsewhere, and create hazards all across the station. They aren't even paying for the fuel, and I checked the account they said to charge the costs to. Nothing will ever come out of there. Might as well waste the fuel. That gave her an idea. Why not just dump all the fuel if the Zoltans were just going to steal it anyway? A tiny smile ghosted across her face as she began to plan her own little rebellion. A few minutes later, She felt ready to put the plan in action and called for her lead engineer. Then every alarm on her command deck went off. She punched them down irritably and called for a status report while pulling up the plot. She saw FTL vectors painted on the plot, all coming in from the void. Then her head controller's voice sounded in her ear.
"Incoming military fleet, Commander. I have no idea what they are, but they are coming in from a lot of different directions. Based on what I am seeing here, they outmass the Altan war fleet already here by at least a third. We have to evacuate, ma'am. The Zoltan must be planning to subdue us all and force us into work camps. My wife and children are on the station. We should have enough time."
Looma looked up at the controller and gave him her best piercing stare.
"Get to a ship and die when the Altan start shooting those who choose to run, instead of staying with their community and trying to care for your fellows."
The controller had the good graces to look sheepish as he hung his head and focused on his station. For herself, Looma pressed her feet hard into the faux grass of the deck to keep from trying to run herself. She considered trying to open a channel to the incoming fleet, but decided not to bother. The high and mighty Zoltan wouldn't want to deal with a lowly Kothro. She closed her eyes and took deep breaths, trying to calm herself. They should have a bull in charge of this station by now. They should. I know that a war council has been assembled, and I know that the bulls are in charge. Why aren't they?
"Commander, I am getting a request for a data feed of all sensor data over the QCO I'm in. I can't make sense of the authentication codes. I think the transmission is encrypted using..."
Looma's eyes snapped open, and something stirred deep within her belly. Could that be what hope feels like? I think I had forgotten. She pushed the thought aside and spoke with urgency.
"Route it to my console, now."
It only took a cursory glance for her to recognize the military auth codes, but she slammed her fingers on the appropriate buttons, just to be sure. When the results came back green, she slapped the controls to secure the command deck so hard she probably bruised her hand, stood, and slammed her foot to the deck for attention. She had to raise her voice to be heard over the alarm klaxons she'd just set off.
"All of you route every scrap of data you have to Comms Station 1. Comms 1, your job, your entire purpose for existence from this moment, until I say otherwise, is to make sure that every scrap of data you can fit into that channel goes through it. Your top priority is up to the microsecond sensor data. If you have bandwidth left, after that feed them any Zoltan comms traffic we managed to pick up. Comms 2. You can tell that Rook's a freighter captain. He is welcome to stay right where he is through the fighting. Comms 3. You are in charge of packaging Sultan comms data and routing it to Comms 1. Prioritize anything you have that is unencrypted, but send him everything. Comms 5. Get on the horn to that damned Zoltan freighter who thinks he is bumping our Rook's friend, and tell him to heave to until the battle is over. If he gives you any lip, hand him over to weapon."
A tear rolled down her cheek as she looked up at the plot and the incoming ships. We are saved. My world, my community, is safe. Thank the fates.
All of you. I don't know exactly who that fleet belongs to, but those were military authentication codes.
She took a moment to study the plot and saw all of the Zoltan military ships, which had been lazily maintaining their positions, had begun to move with deadly purpose.
Look at these Zoltan ships. They know that what comes is no friend of theirs. We are saved, my friends. We are saved. Still, there are far too many Sultan on this station, and the next few hours are going to be hard on us all. We have our part to play in this. Don't let me down. Don't let the community down."
Nervous pairs of eyes looked back and forth from one another, but finally they all seemed to shrug, one by one, and turn back to their tasks. The last few weeks have been hard, and they know being here is more dangerous than anything they ever thought to do. What is a few more hours of a little greater danger? She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding when the last of her people turned back to work, just as the blast doors slammed home and sealed them in. She sat back in her chair and checked to make sure that the approaching fleet's request for sensor data had been fulfilled. She did a double take when she got a look at the throughput on the QCOM channel. They didn't have that much QCOM bandwidth. She looked up at Comms 1, who stared bug-eyed at his own screen, obviously just as lost about the origin of the bandwidth as her. Then, One of the interstation channels lit up with a priority call. She hit the button to accept, expecting to her security chief. Instead, she found herself staring into the face of a battle-scarred bull she'd never seen. The bull gazed at her with an intensity that at another time and place could have. She banished that line of thought as he spoke.
You are current commander on watch? Yes. I have just over 100 bulls on station at my command. We have been secreting ourselves onto the station since the trouble started and hiding wherever we could. We also brought along some extra QKOM units which are linked to the Central Council Exchange. My instructions were to wait to contact you until the fleet was in range of your sensor. I am going to guess, by the general alarm that has been sounded through the station, that you have the fleet on sensors?
She nodded, and he continued.
Good. We did our best to patch the QQRMs into your network so that you can use them to route data. Did we do it right?
She found herself unable to do anything other than nod mutely. He gave her a hard smile.
Good. We are fighters, not technicians.
The man visibly straightened, and his tone took on an official air.
On behalf of the Kothro War Council, I formally take command of this station and all military operations on it. You, Commander, will retain civilian authority and traffic control. I, however, will be taking over station's security and weapons. Could you please have your weapons masters route all firing control to the station I am using? I will route it to my bulls from there.